You
I
think you can
told
come
you to
crawling
check
back
the
to
trunk!
my
I
dock
did.
after
It
what
wasn't
you did to
there.
me?
Everyone, please calm down.
My
This is
husband stood on the
ridiculous.
dock of my own father's lake house, his mistress beside him, wearing my dead mother's straw hat, and told me I was nothing to him now. He said it loud enough for our neighbor across the cove, out working on his boat motor, to stop and turn his head. Loud enough for Calvin, the man who'd looked after that property since before I was born, to hear it from the tool shed. And loud enough for his own mother, sitting in my grandmother's rocking chair with a glass of my mother's sweet tea in her hand, to smile like she'd been waiting years for that exact sentence. My name is Jocelyn Banks. I'm 52 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that if you gave enough of yourself to the people you loved, they would never let you feel small. That belief lasted exactly 18 years of marriage, until the afternoon my husband looked me dead in the eye, in front of witnesses, and said those words. But here's the part nobody expected, not even me. An hour later, I was the one who locked the door. And by the time the sun went down over Lake Norman that evening, the man who said those words was standing outside his own front porch, begging to be let back in. Before we get into the story, sit with that for a second. Because sometimes, the moment someone tries to erase you is the exact moment you find out how much you were never going to let them. Let me take you back to that Saturday morning in October, when I was still just a woman driving up Highway 21 with a full tank of gas and no idea her whole life was about to turn inside out. It had rained the night before, the kind of soft Carolina rain that leaves the air smelling like wet pine and turned earth. I remember the sound of my tires on the 2-lane road outside Mooresville, the fog still sitting low over the water as I came around the bend near the marina. I'd made that drive from my house in Charlotte more times than I could count, almost 3 hours round trip if traffic was bad on I-77, but it never stopped feeling like coming home. My father built that lake house with his own hands back in 1988, board by board, on a quiet stretch of shoreline near Mooresville, and every pine and dock post out there still smelled like him if you stood close enough. That morning started like any other. I'd had my coffee at 6, same chipped mug I've used since Corey was in middle school, and I was halfway through wiping down the kitchen counter when my phone rang. It was Calvin Dixon, 69 years old, the man who has looked after that property since before I was born, since my daddy hired him back when Calvin was still young and strong-backed and honest-faced. Calvin doesn't call unless something's wrong. He's not a man who wastes words. "Miss Jocelyn," he said, concern sitting heavy behind his voice. "There's people moving furniture into the lake house. Strangers. Thought you ought to know before I called anybody else." I laughed it off at first. I figured Andre, my husband of 18 years, invited friends up for the weekend and forgot to mention it. That would have been like him. Andre Powell, 55 years old, has never once in our marriage remembered to tell me anything that might inconvenience his plans. So I got in my car. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself a lot of things that morning that turned out not to be true. None of us knew yet that this was the first scene in what would become the kind of drama family story our whole corner of the lake still talks about. By the time I turned onto the gravel drive, the iron gate, the one my father installed after Hurricane Hugo tore through in '89, was standing wide open. Andre's black Range Rover sat crooked near the boathouse, and next to it, a cherry red convertible I didn't recognize. I need you to understand something about that lake house before I go further, because it matters. It isn't just wood and glass sitting on the water. It's the place my father, Micah Banks, poured his life savings and his own 2 hands into after 30 years as a master carpenter in Charlotte. It's where my mother, Camille, canned peaches every August until the year she passed. It's where I got married. It's where my son took his first steps on the dock. It is, in every sense that matters, the last piece of my parents still standing in this world. I parked behind Calvin's truck and walked up the gravel path with my heart doing something strange in my chest. Not racing exactly, more like it was bracing itself. And there on the dock, the same dock my father built out of Brazilian teak the summer before he died, stood my husband. Andre was dressed like he was posing for a real estate brochure. White linen pants, pressed shirt, his expensive sunglasses hooked in the collar like always, standing with his hands on his hips, looking out over the water like a man surveying something he already owned. Beside him stood a woman I'd never officially met, though I'd seen her name light up his phone screen enough times to know exactly who she was. Kendra Miles, 34, tall and polished, wearing my mother's old straw sun hat, the one Mama bought the last summer before the cancer took her, the one that still had a faint water stain on the brim from a storm back in 2003. And in the rocking chair on the porch, my grandmother's rocking chair, sat Monique Warren, my mother-in-law, 71 years old, sipping sweet tea from a glass etched with a cursive letter C. Camille's glass.
My mother's glass.
Monique was smiling the way you smile when you've been waiting a long time for a moment exactly like this one. Andre turned and looked at me. He took his time doing it, the way he does everything, like the world owes him the patience to arrive whenever he pleases. Then he said it again, the same words, but this time I was standing close enough to see his mouth shape every syllable, close enough that there was no mistaking who it was meant for. You're nothing to me now. I want to tell you I screamed. I want to tell you I fell apart right there on my father's dock. That's not what happened. Something went very still inside my chest instead. Not broken, still, like a held breath. I looked past Andre, past Kendra in my mother's hat, and saw the suitcases lined up on the porch, an open bottle of wine sweating on the rail. Kendra's sandals kicked off near the sliding glass door my father installed himself. And through the window, on the mantel, the framed photograph of my parents on their wedding day, turned face down. That last detail is the one that still sits with me. Not the affair, not the cruelty of his words. The fact that somebody had walked into that house and turned my parents' faces to the wood. Andre stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound reasonable to anyone listening. The divorce is basically done, Jocelyn. Don't make a scene in front of people. Kendra let out a small laugh, tilting her head. I'd learned later that tilt was practiced, like everything about her. Andre said you liked to perform whenever you felt left out. I didn't answer either one of them. I walked past all three, past my husband, past his mother, past the woman standing on my mother's memory in a stranger's sandals, and reached into my bag for the old brass key my father gave me the day he finished building that house. I let myself in. And then I turned the deadbolt. Behind me, Andre laughed first, like it was a joke. Then he knocked. Then he pounded. Monique was already on her phone, her voice climbing. Kendra had stopped laughing altogether. I walked into the kitchen, hands shaking just slightly, more from the strangeness of the moment than fear. The old drawer where my father used to keep batteries and rubber bands and twine was still exactly where it had always been. I pulled it open out of habit more than purpose, and that's when I saw it. An envelope, yellowed at the edges, wedged in the back corner, undisturbed for years. Inside, a single sheet, in my father's handwriting, dated 7 years earlier. If the day ever comes he dares tell you you're nothing, remember, I already prepared for it. There's a second copy of the trust in the floor safe under the bedroom, along with a record of every time he asked about the value of this land. Don't cry. Lock the door. I stood in that kitchen a long time, the paper trembling slightly in my hand, while my husband kept pounding on the door behind me. For 18 years, Jocelyn had confused endurance with love, believing that if she just gave enough, stayed calm enough, sacrificed enough, she'd never have to lose anything that mattered. What she feared most wasn't losing Andre. It was discovering that all that giving had actually been disappearing. Her father's letter didn't just hand her legal protection, it handed her permission to finally choose herself without calling it selfish. For the first time in my life, I understood that my father had seen this coming before I ever did. And I needed to know exactly how much more he'd prepared for. If you think that letter was the biggest surprise waiting for Jocelyn that day, stay with me, because what she finds next changes everything you think you know about this family. I sat down at my mother's old kitchen table with that letter still in my hand. And while my husband's fists kept landing on the front door, I did the only thing that made sense to me. I called Calvin. Change the gate code, I told him. All of it. And call the Iredell County Sheriff's Office, please. Tell them there's a property dispute out here. Nothing more. Calvin didn't ask a single question. That's the kind of man he is. He just said, "Yes, ma'am," and got to work. While I waited, the memories came, one after another, like a drawer packed too tight finally giving way. I met Andre Powell when I was 29, working as an operations manager for a food distribution nonprofit in Charlotte. The kind of job that didn't pay much but let me sleep at night. Andre was ambitious even then, already talking about potential and leverage the way other men talk about the weather. The first time I brought him to the lake house, he walked the property like an appraiser, not a guest. We got married right there on that dock. My father cried through the whole ceremony, then pulled me aside and said only one thing. "Baby, I just want you safe and happy." I didn't understand then how much weight he was putting behind those words. After my father passed, things started shifting slowly, the way water erodes a riverbank. So gradually you don't notice the shape of the land has changed until it's already gone. Andre pushed to rent the lake house out during peak season. He wanted to tear out my mother's old kitchen and modernize it. Monique kept suggesting in that syrupy voice of hers that the property should be folded into shared marital assets. Because, she always said, family should share everything. What none of us said out loud yet was that this quiet tug of war was the opening act of a drama family neither of us could see the shape of. What none of them knew, or maybe what they simply chose to forget, was everything I had already given. 12 years ago, I used every dollar of my mother's life insurance, money that could have finished my own graduate degree, to help Andre buy into his company. He held my hand across this very table and promised he'd pay it back. He never paid back a single dollar. I also turned down a director of operations position with a nonprofit in Washington, D.C., because Andre said he needed me in Charlotte to host his client dinners. I smiled and said, "Family first." I believed it when I said it. Our son, Corey, drifted from me over the years, mostly because Andre had a habit of saying things like, "Your mother lives with ghosts more than the living," right in front of him. The affair didn't arrive all at once. It leaked in slowly. A hotel charge here, 2 spa appointments there. Kendra's name lighting up his phone at midnight. I'd suspected something was wrong for the better part of a year, and by that spring, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I quietly filed for divorce in March, before I'd even confronted him about her name. I didn't want to fight. I wanted an exit. When I finally asked him outright about Kendra, Andre didn't flinch. "I got lonely," he said, "because you disappeared into this family and that old lake house." I didn't scream that day either. I called my attorney, Gabrielle Lawson, and let her carry what I couldn't say out loud. That night, after Andre went to sleep in the guest room, I opened the cedar box my father left behind and read through every document inside it. The lake house sat inside the Banks Family Preservation Trust. No spouse, no creditor, no outside party could claim any portion of it without my signature. While searching my old phone for anything that might help Gabrielle build our case, I stumbled onto a voicemail Andre had left me 8 years earlier, one I'd forgotten even existed. His voice on that recording was softer than I remembered. "I'm going to get your name added to the company shares soon as the second funding round closes. You believed in me from day one, Jocelyn. I'm not going to let you just be the woman standing behind me." I sat there holding my phone, staring at a promise that had never been kept, and understood something clearly for the first time. That promise wasn't a broken accident. It was the first thread in a plan that had been unraveling toward this exact day for a very long time. That's when Calvin called back. His voice was short, careful.
"Please, let's just talk.
"Sheriff's on the way,"
here?
he said. "But there's something else you should know before they get here." I gripped the phone a little tighter. "What is it, Calvin?" He paused just long enough that I could hear my own heartbeat in the silence. "It's about how long this has been planned." Whatever Calvin found out, it was enough to rattle a man who never raises his voice. And in the next part of this story, you'll understand exactly why. Andre says the divorce was basically already finished. Jocelyn says the trust protects everything he's about to lose. Who do you believe, Team Andre or Team Jocelyn? Drop your answer below in one word. The Iredell County deputy arrived 12 minutes later, a folder already in hand. Gabrielle had emailed the trust documents ahead of time, just in case. Andre tried to play it off the second the deputy stepped out of the car. "This is just a marital disagreement," he said, straightening his shirt like that alone might restore his authority. The deputy looked at him evenly. "According to this documentation, sir, this property belongs to a family trust your wife administers. You're welcome to leave on your own, or I can treat continued presence here as trespassing. Your choice." Kendra pulled my mother's straw hat off her head so fast it nearly landed in the grass. Monique went quiet for the first time since I'd arrived. The two men who'd been carrying furniture in started quietly loading it back onto the truck. That's when Corey's car came flying up the gravel drive. My son stepped out, looked at the scene, and said, right in front of everyone, "Dad said you were overreacting because you're jealous. Mom, this house belongs to the family too." Something in me ached hearing that. I thought back to the summer Corey was a junior, when private school tuition jumped without warning. Andre said the company was going through a rough patch. I picked up overnight shifts at a food distribution warehouse for 6 straight months, coming home at 2 a.m. with swollen feet, and never told a soul what I was doing to keep him in that school. I looked at Corey and kept my voice steady. "This house belongs to your grandfather, and your grandfather made it clear. Nobody gets to turn it into a trophy." Andre grabbed my wrist as I turned back toward the house. Calvin stepped between us instantly. "Let go," he said. Just that. Andre let go. I didn't lock the door again. There was no need to. The deputy was already standing between Andre and the porch steps, and for the first time all day, Andre understood he had nowhere left to push. Corey stood frozen on the steps, arms crossed, jaw tight. I could see something working behind his eyes, the kind of look a person gets when they've been carrying a thought around for weeks, waiting to see if they'd ever have to say it out loud. Corey wasn't defending his father out of blindness. He was protecting the only version of his family he'd allowed himself to believe in. Choosing his mother meant admitting the man he'd modeled his own confidence after had been lying to everyone, including him. What finally broke through wasn't proof. It was the humiliation of realizing he'd been used as a prop in a story he never agreed to be part of. Then, quietly, his voice shaking, he spoke. "Dad and Kendra were on the phone once, back in the spring, when I was in the back seat. She called this place our weekend place and asked when the divorce would be final so they could redo the furniture. Dad laughed and said, 'As long as your mother doesn't make a big thing out of it.'" The air on that porch went dead silent. Andre turned to look at his own son, and for the first time all day, I saw something real cross his face. Not fear of losing the house, but fear of being exposed in front of the one person he'd spent years trying to control. The deputy turned toward Kendra next, nodding at the bag on her shoulder. "Ma'am, anything that came out of this house needs to go back inside it." Kendra's face went tight. She reached into her purse and set my mother's pearl necklace on the porch rail without a word, not meeting my eyes. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. By the time the deputy's cruiser pulled off the gravel drive, half of Mooresville already had wind of the drama family unfolding out on the bank's property. The kind of story that moves through a small lake town faster than the water itself. Andre was looking at his own son like he was staring at a hole blown clean through every plan he'd made. Andre thought the worst of the day was behind him. He had no idea his own son had just handed his mother the very thing she needed to finish what her father started. 3 weeks after the day I locked that door, I sat in the same kitchen with Gabrielle Lawson and Calvin Dixon, maps and file folders spread across the table between us. Those 3 weeks hadn't felt like healing exactly, more like the slow work of setting a broken bone before it can start knitting back together. I'd started waking before 6 every morning, not out of habit anymore, but out of something closer to purpose. I'd make coffee in that same chipped mug, carry it down to the dock while the fog was still sitting low over the water, and just stand there. Some mornings I cried. Most mornings I didn't. But every morning I looked at that house, at the teak boards my father laid by hand, At the porch light, Calvin always left burning for me now, whether I was coming or not. And I reminded myself of one thing. I am the one who decides what happens to what's left of them. Calvin had taken to arriving early those mornings too, always with some small errand as an excuse. Checking the dock cleats, clearing leaves from the gutters. But I understood, even then, that he was really just making sure I wasn't alone with the silence. He never said it outright. Men like Calvin rarely do. But he'd linger at the bottom of the porch steps a beat longer than the task required, glance up at the kitchen window until he saw me moving inside, and only then would he get back in his truck. I didn't know yet how far that quiet watchfulness would go, or how much of it had been asked of him years before I ever needed it. That morning, the kitchen smelled like dark roast and the cedar Gabrielle always seemed to carry on her coat from her downtown office. She set her briefcase on the same table where I'd once let Andre hold my hand and promise he'd pay me back. The irony wasn't lost on me. Gabrielle noticed the pause when I set the mugs down. She always noticed things like that. And she gave me a moment before she spoke. "You ready for this?" she asked, not unkindly. "I've been ready since I read my father's letter," I said, and I meant it. Gabrielle slid a thick folder toward me, her voice calm but sharp as a blade. "Andre has known about the bank's Family Preservation Trust since March, right around when your divorce filing went through. He hired a separate attorney to petition for temporary possession during the proceedings. It was denied in the first round. The language on page 9 is airtight. He brought people up here anyway. This wasn't a misunderstanding, Jocelyn. This was a test, to see if you'd fight back or fold." I felt my jaw tighten before I even had words for the feeling. Calvin, standing near the counter with his arms crossed, went very still. The kind of stillness I'd only seen in him once before, the day he called to tell me strangers were in the house. "A test," I repeated. "A calculated one," Gabrielle said. "People don't usually move furniture into a house they're not sure they can keep. He was betting you'd back down rather than make a scene in front of his mother and his..." She paused, choosing the word carefully. "His companion." I flipped through the pages and found an email Andre sent to a development partner nearly a year earlier. My eyes moved down the screen of the printed page slowly, the way you read something twice because the first pass doesn't feel real. In his own words, "My wife is basically just the caretaker. Once the divorce is final, the land will be more flexible." I read that sentence over and over. 18 years I had called myself his wife. He had called me the caretaker. Something in my chest didn't break so much as settle. The last soft place in me, the part that had still been hoping there was an explanation, closing over like a scar. Gabrielle must have seen it on my face because she reached over and put her hand flat on the folder, not on me, just near me, the way you'd steady a table that had started to wobble. "There's something else," she said. "This email is dated 14 months ago, before the affair became obvious to you, before you filed. He wasn't reacting to your marriage falling apart, Jocelyn. He was already planning around this land while you two were still going to church together on Sundays." I thought of every dinner I'd made him that year, every night I'd stayed up waiting for him to come home from client meetings that ran late. I thought about how ordinary those months had felt to me, how completely unremarkable, while somewhere behind my back, a plan had already been drawn up for a version of my life that didn't include me. "Why didn't he just ask me outright?" I said quietly. "Why all of this?" Calvin answered before Gabrielle could. "Because he knew you'd say no," he said. "And a man like that doesn't like hearing no. He likes finding a way around it." I didn't respond to that. I didn't need to. I just closed the folder, set my hand flat on top of it, and said, "Then let's make sure he never gets the chance to." What followed wasn't dramatic. It was slower than that, and in its own way, harder. I threw myself into learning every clause of that trust the way I imagined my father must have studied every board and beam before he ever drove a nail into this house. Late at night, after Corey had gone quiet in his old room down the hall, he'd started staying over some weekends, something neither of us mentioned out loud but both understood as its own kind of repair. I'd sit at the kitchen table with the trust documents spread out like a puzzle, reading the same paragraphs until the legal language stopped sounding foreign and started sounding like armor. I walked the property boundary lines with Calvin more times than I could count that fall, The two of us moving slowly through the tree line while he pointed out markers only he remembered. A rusted stake here, a blaze cut into a pine trunk there, decades old. Your daddy walked this same line with me the summer he built the boathouse, Calvin told me once, kicking at a half-buried survey marker with the toe of his boot. Told me, Calvin, land like this doesn't belong to whoever's loudest about wanting it. It belongs to whoever loves it quiet, year after year, when nobody's watching. He didn't say anything else after that, just kept walking. But I noticed he said it the way a man says something he's been saving up to say at exactly the right moment. I didn't think much of it then. I would think of it again, later, standing at that gate in October, and again in the spring, on a day I still hadn't imagined yet. I met with land conservation attorneys in Charlotte, who explained shoreline easements to me in language even more precise than Gabrielle's. I met with families who'd lived along Lake Norman for 3-4 generations, people who understood, the way I was only just beginning to, that land like this isn't really owned so much as it's tended, passed hand to hand, protected on behalf of people who aren't here to protect it themselves anymore. One older woman, Mrs. Adele Simmons, whose family had been on the lake since before it was even a lake, before the dam went in and the valley flooded in the 1960s, took my hand across her kitchen table and said, "Honey, they always come first for the shoreline, always. Because shoreline is the one thing they can't build more of." I carried that sentence with me into the hearing room weeks later, like a stone in my pocket. By the time the leaves had gone from green to rust along Highway 21, I wasn't the same woman who'd driven up that road in October with no idea her life was about to turn inside out. I still made the same coffee in the same chipped mug, but I read contracts now the way I used to read recipes, carefully, completely, trusting nothing I hadn't checked myself. The day of the Mooresville Planning Board hearing, the community center parking lot was fuller than I'd expected. Folding chairs spilling out into the hallway, the smell of burnt coffee from an urn someone had set up near the door, the low murmur of a room that already sensed something was about to happen, even if most people there didn't yet know what. I walked in and found Andre standing beside Kendra, in front of glossy renderings of a luxury lakeside resort, one that needed direct shoreline access through exactly the acreage the bank's trust controlled. Under the fluorescent lights, the renderings looked almost gaudy. Turquoise infinity pools superimposed over a shoreline I had swum in as a girl. A rendering of sunset cabanas standing where my mother once canned peaches every August. Andre saw me. The color drained from his face in an instant. I watched it happen. Watched the practiced composure slip for just a second before he caught it and pulled it back into place, the way he always did, the way he'd done on that dock in October. But I'd seen it. And so, I noticed, had Kendra, whose eyes flicked between the two of us with something that wasn't quite confidence anymore. When the floor opened for public comment, several older residents stood to speak about how much of the public shoreline had already disappeared to development. An older man in a Carolina Panthers cap talked about the boat launch his grandfather used to take him to that didn't exist anymore. A woman near the back, her voice trembling slightly with age, talked about the herons that used to nest along that stretch of shore before a different development went in 5 years back. Then it was my turn. I walked to the microphone, and for 1/2 second, my legs remembered how to shake. The same tremor I'd felt walking up that gravel drive in October. I let it pass through me instead of fighting it, the way Gabrielle had taught me. You don't have to feel steady to sound steady, she'd told me the night before. You just have to know what's true. My name is Jocelyn Banks. I'm the sole trustee of the Banks Family Land Trust. My voice caught for just a breath on my own last name, the name I'd started using again instead of Powell, a small thing nobody in that room would have noticed except me. This trust does not consent to any transfer, lease, or partnership tied to this project, and without our shoreline easement, the project as proposed cannot move forward. A ripple went through the room, not loud, just a shift, chairs creaking, a few heads turning toward Andre. Corey, sitting in the back, stood up in front of the entire room. I hadn't asked him to come. I hadn't even known for certain he would. He'd told me only that morning over the phone, in a voice that still sounded unsure of itself, that he wanted to actually see it this time, instead of hearing about it secondhand. Watching him rise from his chair, I felt something in my chest pull tight. Pride and fear tangled together. The particular ache of watching your child choose a harder truth over an easier lie. I used to think my mother was holding on to the past too tightly. He said, his voice cracking slightly on mother before steadying. Today, I understand my father was trying to sell my grandfather's future. The room went silent in that specific way rooms go silent when something true has just been said out loud. A major investor in the front row quietly gathered his papers and walked out without a glance at Andre. Kendra's hand, I noticed, had gone still on the edge of the poster board she'd been holding, her knuckles pale. The project collapsed that same afternoon. 2 weeks later, Andre was placed on unpaid leave from his company, pending restructuring. Kendra transferred to a job in another city within a couple of months. That night, Corey drove back to the lake house instead of straight home, and we sat out on the porch steps together, not talking much, just sitting, the way we used to when he was small and couldn't sleep. At one point, he said without looking at me, "I'm sorry it took me this long to see it." I told him he didn't need to apologize for loving his father. I told him the only thing that mattered now was what he chose to do with what he knew. He nodded, quiet, and for a long time after that, we just listened to the water. Andre had lost the project. He'd lost his position. He'd lost face in front of an entire community. But I knew him well enough after 18 years to understand something else, too. A man like Andre doesn't accept defeat quietly. He looks for a way to strike back. Andre thought losing everything in public was his lowest point. He had no idea the next confession, the one he'd make himself, would be even harder to live down. October gave way to a colder, quieter kind of fall. The kind where the lake starts to look like tempered glass in the mornings, and the dock boards go stiff and gray with the first frosts. I'd started to find a rhythm again, mornings with coffee, afternoons with Gabrielle's paperwork, evenings when Corey would sometimes call just to talk, no agenda, the way sons are supposed to call their mothers. I told myself the hardest part was over. I was wrong, but only by a little. That fall, the gate camera picked up Andre's car pulling up the drive, and Calvin called to let me know before I ever heard the engine. "He's alone," Calvin said, his voice careful, the same careful tone he'd used the day he first called about strangers moving furniture. No Kendra, no Monique, just him sitting in the car at the gate. Been sitting there a full minute now, not even getting out. I stood at the kitchen window for a moment, watching the gray light move over the water, and made a decision I hadn't fully expected to make. "I'll go down," I told him. "Stay close, but let me talk to him first." "I'll be right there by the shed," Calvin said. "Won't say a word unless you need me to." I walked out to the iron gate alone. No Kendra, no Monique, no audience this time. The air had that particular bite of early November, sharp enough to catch in my throat, and the gravel crunched under my boots the whole way down, a sound I'd come to associate with turning points, whether I wanted to or not. Somewhere behind me, at the edge of my vision, I could see Calvin's shape near the tool shed, exactly where he said he'd be, not moving, just watching, the way he'd watched over that property for 40 years. Andre stood on the other side of the bars in a gray jacket, looking smaller than I remembered him. The linen and the pressed shirt were gone. He looked like a man who hadn't slept well in weeks, which, I would learn later, he hadn't. He gripped the iron with both hands. "I lost the project, Jocelyn. I might lose my position too. I need you to reconsider the trust's stance, for the sake of people's jobs." I looked at him steadily, watching his breath fog in the cold air between us, watching his hands tighten and loosen on the bars, like he couldn't decide whether he was asking or demanding. "The people already spoke," I said. He was quiet a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost all its old command. "My mother told me if I established a presence before the divorce was final, the court would have a harder time removing me. She said a locked door still opens if you apply enough pressure." I listened to her. I was wrong. There was a stillness that followed that confession, broken only by the far-off call of a heron somewhere down the shoreline and the small, tinny creak of the gate hinge shifting in the wind. I watched something cross his face I hadn't seen since the earliest years of our marriage. Not the practiced reasonableness he wore like a second suit, but something rawer underneath it, something that looked almost like the man I'd married before ambition had hollowed him out and filled the space with other things. Andre had spent his whole life measuring his worth in what he controlled: a company, a property, a wife who wouldn't push back. Standing at that gate, stripped of all three, his fear wasn't losing Jocelyn. It was being seen for the first time as a man without leverage. His confession wasn't remorse so much as surrender, the only language he had left once power stopped working. Even Monique, the woman who'd helped set this whole drama family performance in motion, wanted it over, now that the community had already picked a side, and it wasn't hers. I thought about the email Gabrielle had shown me, proof he'd been circling this land for longer than he'd ever admit. I didn't need him to confess it twice. I just looked at him and said what mattered. Love isn't ownership, Andre. You kept demanding I prove it by handing over pieces of myself. Eventually, there weren't any pieces left I wanted to give. He didn't argue. That, more than anything he said, told me how far he'd fallen from the man on that dock in October. The old Andre would have found a rebuttal, some smooth turn of phrase to soften the blow and put himself back on top of the conversation. This Andre just stood there, hands slack on the iron bars, and let the words land. I turned and walked back toward the house. He didn't call after me. Halfway up the drive, Calvin fell into step beside me without a word, the way he used to walk my father back to the house after a long day of work on the dock, decades before I was old enough to notice men had their own quiet ways of taking care of each other. Neither of us spoke until we reached the porch steps. "You did good," Calvin said finally. "Doesn't feel like winning," I told him. "It's not supposed to," he said. "Winning never feels like you thought it would. It just feels like quiet." He looked back once toward the gate, where Andre's taillights were already disappearing down the gravel road, then back at me. "Your daddy used to say the same thing about this land. Said the day it was finally safe, it wouldn't feel like triumph. It'd just feel like being able to breathe again." I stood on that porch a long while after Calvin's truck pulled away, listening to the wind move through the pines, feeling the particular kind of tired that comes after a fight finally ends. Not relief exactly, but its early cousin. That evening, Monique called, her voice thick with tears. "Family should heal, for Corey's sake." I gave her one sentence before I hung up the phone. Family isn't built on public humiliation. The gate closed behind me. The code had already been changed. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I owed anyone an explanation for becoming someone they hadn't planned on. Andre thought that confession at the gate was the end of the story, but there was one more truth still waiting to come out, and it would change how Jocelyn saw everything. Winter came and went quieter than I expected. I spent most of it indoors, going through the last of my father's boxes in the attic, finding things I hadn't known I was looking for. His old tape measure, still marked with pencil notches from measuring Corey's height the summer he turned 6. A stack of receipts from the lumber yard in Mooresville, dated the year the house was finished. A photograph of my mother, laughing on the dock, mid-motion, her head thrown back, a moment nobody had posed for. I started to understand, turning those things over in my hands one by one, that healing wasn't a single door closing. It was 100 small ones, opened gently, one at a time, until the house felt like mine again, instead of a battlefield. The following spring, the bank's land trust held a small dedication ceremony for a modest building near the lake house, named the Micah and Camille Banks Lake Stewardship House. The morning of the ceremony came up soft and warm, the kind of Carolina spring day that makes you forget winter ever happened at all. Dogwoods were blooming along the drive, and somebody, Calvin I'd learn later, though he never admitted it outright, had strung small white lights along the porch railing the night before, the same railing where Kendra's sandals had once sat kicked off by the sliding door. Children ran along the grass, chasing each other barefoot despite their parents' warnings about ticks. Older neighbors sat under a tent Calvin helped set up himself, wearing his nicest button-down shirt, trying hard not to cry when the sign went up. Mrs. Adele Simmons was there too, sitting near the front in a folding chair someone had brought specially for her, nodding slowly at the sign like it confirmed something she'd known all along. I stood near the back of the small crowd, my hand resting on the strap of my bag, feeling my heart do that same strange, bracing thing it had done the morning I walked up this same gravel path 6 months earlier. Except this time, it wasn't dread. It was something closer to reverence. Corey stood in front of the small crowd, neighbors, volunteers, a couple of local reporters, and took a deep breath before speaking. I watched his hands, the way they gripped the edge of a folded index card he never actually looked down at. The way his eyes found mine once in the crowd before he began, like he needed to know I was there before he could say what he'd come to say. I found my father's private notes on his old work computer. He'd planned to pressure my mother into selling the lake house right after the divorce to fund his development. He wrote it plainly. She won't fight back if she loses her whole support system. Today I understand that the door my mother locked didn't just keep my father out. It saved the rest of my life and the lives of everyone who still calls this lake home. The crowd went still. A few people wiped their eyes. I felt my own throat tighten, not with grief this time, but with something that had been missing for a long time. The simple, uncomplicated pride of watching your child choose truth, even when it costs him something. Later, once most of the guests had wandered toward the water, Calvin came and stood beside me, speaking low enough that only I could hear. Before he passed, your daddy told me something. Said if the day ever came you locked that door on Andre, no matter how much he cried or threatened, I wasn't to open it, because he already knew that day was coming, and he wanted you to finally have your peace. I looked at him for a long moment, the pieces of the last 6 months settling into place. The way Calvin never once questioned my instructions. The way he'd shown up at that gate before I even called him. The way he'd walked those boundary lines with me all fall, like a man fulfilling a promise older than I knew existed. How long did you know? I asked him. Since before you were even married to him, Calvin said, looking out over the water instead of at me. Your daddy wasn't a man who trusted easy. He watched Andre walk this property that first summer like he was pricing it, not loving it. Told me that same week, Calvin, keep an eye on things after I'm gone. Not because I don't trust my daughter, because I don't trust him. He paused, the corner of his mouth pulling into something that wasn't quite a smile. Wasn't my place to say anything before now. Wasn't the time. Man just asked me to be ready when the time came. So I was ready. I didn't say anything for a while. I just stood there, watching a light move across the water, understanding for the first time the full shape of what my father had built for me. Not just a house, not just a trust, but a whole quiet architecture of protection, put in place years before I ever needed it, carried faithfully by a man who never once asked for credit. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone on the dock. Lake Norman lay quiet under the moonlight, silver and still. Somewhere behind me, I heard the screen door creak, and Corey came out to sit beside me without a word, the way he used to when he was small, and the thunderstorms scared him too much to sleep. We didn't talk for a long time. We just sat there, listening to the water lap gently against the pilings. Two people who'd both had to relearn what family was supposed to feel like. You okay, Mom? He asked eventually. I am, I told him. And for the first time in a long time, it was true. I thought about the words that started all of this. You're nothing to me now. The day Andre said that, he thought he was erasing me, but that sentence was the very thing that finally freed me from protecting a man who'd spent years planning to make me disappear. The door I locked didn't just hold on to a house, it held on to my parents' whole legacy, the shoreline they loved, my son's future, and for the first time in 18 years, it held on to me. The old boards creaked gently beneath me as the evening cooled. Andre used to call that sound tired, worn out. To me now, it sounds like memory breathing. What began as one cruel sentence on a dock had turned, in the retelling, into the kind of drama family story neighbors still bring up at church potlucks, not as gossip, but as proof that quiet people can still win. This story reminds us that dignity isn't loud, it's a decision, made quietly and kept. If you're in a season where someone close to you has made you feel like less than you are, here's something practical, not poetic. Go find your paperwork. The deed, the will, the account statements. Know exactly what's yours before you ever need to defend it. Call the person who still shows up for you, the way Calvin showed up for Jocelyn, and let them help carry what feels too heavy alone. If certain dinners have started feeling like performances instead of comfort, it's all right to skip one and spend that evening with a cup of tea and your own thoughts instead. You don't owe your presence to a table where you're not respected. And if someone you love needs time to see a hard truth, give them room to get there in their own time, the way Corey did. But don't wait on that porch forever while you do. Lock the door if you need to, not out of anger, out of love for everything and everyone still worth protecting.